All right. We are very excited today. This isn't our first time having a guest between me and Bill on our podcast, Almost Awakened. But for me, on No Nonsense Spirituality, this is my very first interview on my own platform. There's no one else I'd rather be co-hosting with than my friend Bill Reel. And there's no one that I'd rather have as my first guest than Rainn Wilson. You may know him as Dwight Schrute, but he is also the author of the book Soul Boom and is having amazing conversations around spirituality on his Soul Boom podcast, and has now come out with a new workbook, the Soul Boom Workbook, that we will be talking about today. Rainn, how are you, my friend?
I'm well, Britt. Thanks. I'm honored that I had no idea I was your first guest. I'm honored to be here. And hi, Bill. I can't believe you're not calling it keeping it real. I'm sure you've had a lot of real puns for podcast names throughout the years.
It's always been a thing that I should have started a bait and tackle shop, but yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so many options with that name.
Yeah.
So
Rainn is pretty good too.
Yeah, it's a good name. All right, and congrats on your new movie, Code 3, and the new workbook. You've had kind of a busy year there. So can you kind of just tell us what was the motivation behind, because it's been a few years since Soul Boom came out, so what was the motivation behind the workbook?
Yeah, so Soul Boom came out 2 years ago, and then about a year and a half ago, we started the Soul Boom podcast. And, you know, Britt, I was like, are people going to care about a former sitcom actor having conversations about spirituality and life's biggest metaphysical questions? I mean, who gives a crap? And people seemed to care, and there seemed to be an audience for it. People were digging the book and digging the podcast and interested in these conversations and seemingly wanting to go farther and wanting to go deeper and wanting to explore more. There were a lot of conversations about this is all great from an ideological standpoint, from like a big picture standpoint, talking about how society could really benefit from, spiritual ideas for social transformation and making our lives better. But how do we put that into practice? What do you do? And I had always been a big fan of The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. And when I did that in the 90s, it really was transformative. And I love the morning pages and the idea of kind of getting up and being creative and um, thinking about the arts through a different lens. And that's what prompted the Soul Boom workbook. I did it with my co-author, Shabnam Mugharabi. She is the co-founder of a media company I had founded a long time ago, 15 years ago, called Soul Pancake. That was a YouTube channel way back in the day, and yeah, so that's why it was started.
And did you have like a specific person in mind? Was it just these people that said, "Hey, I'm loving this, but I just want to go deeper," and you just wanted to provide something for that? So you just had those people in mind when you were writing it, or were you writing it to like your previous self when you were, an addict or an atheist, or like who did you have in mind as you were putting it together?
Well, I think you nailed it on the head there. This is the book that I wish I had had when I was really struggling in my 20s. Um, when maybe a little past my atheist phase, and I was longing for some spiritual solutions, some spiritual questions, and some answers, wanting to walk a spiritual path and not quite sure where to go or what to do. And I think that's where a lot of young people find themselves these days. They have a spiritual hunger and curiosity, and that itch is not being scratched by any specific church necessarily. So, what do? You listen to some podcasts, you listen to you listen to Sam Harris, you listen to Alex O'Connor, you read some books, maybe you try some meditation, um, and then you kind of you dabble in Buddhism, but what exactly do? And so we hope that this book is really for everyone. That even if you're a born again Christian, that you can enjoy it. Even if you're a Muslim or a Buddhist, you can enjoy it. That you can be devout in your faith and deepen your faith through exploring it. Because what we wanted it to do was to bring creativity to spirituality, to bring the arts to spirituality. It's drawing your soul and sketching your favorite sacred space. It's charts and diagrams and artistic exercises. It's journaling, to kind of sometimes, spirituality gets really stuck in church, and the idea of church on Sundays, and um, this comes in through a different portal.
Question for you, Rainn. So you've got the podcast under the same name, Soul Boom. You've got this workbook that just came out. What's been the response to that work as people have recognized you and come to this space where you're trying to talk about spirituality and serious things? What's the response been in terms of the podcast and the workbook more recently?
The response has been pretty positive. And, it's weird. This has it's been a passion of mine. And it's a passion. Like, there's another universe in which I go to divinity school, and study theology, or, study diverse religious traditions that I could teach in that world. I could see myself, living in that world. And for me, and I've shared about this a lot, and Britt and I spoke about it before, like, I've had a lot of mental health challenges, and I've really needed spirituality and a higher power in my life to help me navigate some of them. And so I want to share that with people. I know Britt has had a parallel and very different, experience, but
we both have not done well without spirituality, even though, our spiritual practices may be different. But yeah, we both had periods where like we were not doing so great.
Yeah, indeed. Some dark times.
And I will say, and then Bill had a question after that. I will say that I wanted to kind of not like it. And here's the reason why. So like I'm in the coaching space in this side of things. And so I have workbooks. Every coach has workbooks. I get sent like 5 a day. People send them to me, or people email. So like in my field, we're kind of drowning in workbooks because like in the coaching space, it's just kind of something that we can't see every client who reaches out to us. And so you create courses and workbooks, and it's just kind of part of the gig when you're in kind of this field. But it was so well done. And I really, really love it. What I loved was you brought in, because like you were saying, there is a gap, and it's the gap that I inhabit and the job that I created in this gap. There is a gap there between like the abstract Alex O'Connor philosophical spiritual conversations, and then like getting down into like, what does this look like in my life? And because there's a gap there, I'm able to have a full-time job being a coach in that space. And I really, really love the workbook that it brought it down to what are the concepts of God that you were raised with, and what do you think about it now? What gives you inherent meaning? What are your values? Here are different kinds of prayer. How could you do a help prayer, or a thanks prayer, or a wow, I'm feeling awe prayer? What does that inherently feel like to you? And you really brought down so many podcast conversations of abstract things that are good for you into like, how do you meet this in the unique person that you are? And I really, really did. I wanted to not like it just because I get so many workbooks, but it was really well done and really fantastic.
I appreciate you saying that, Britt. And we put a lot of work into it. We worked really hard on it. We worked for months and months on it because we wanted to give people an experience where you start very simple, like, hey, let's define some terms. What does spirituality mean for you? What does a soul mean? What does that mean to you? Is it something that exists? Is it a feeling? Let's go to God. What's been your past experience with religion, good and bad? Have you been traumatized by it? And then slowly take, you into feelings. How can you make your life better? Do you pray? Do you meditate? What's your connection to nature? And then by the end, we're trying to take the user on a journey to be like, hey, can any of this stuff that we've been experimenting with make our lives better, or make your family lives better, your neighbors' lives better, or America's lives better, or the world's lives better? Is there, or is spirituality, because this is we spoke about this before, and you've spoken about it before, like, is spirituality simply just a way to reduce anxiety? Because sometimes I
Mhm.
feel like in the space, if you on TikTok and online and in the coaching world, it's like, hey, I'll give you 5 spiritual tools to reduce your anxiety, and or make you more productive or something like that. But there's a lot more to spirituality than that. And
Mhm.
I believe that. As a Baha'i, I believe that. But even I think in every faith tradition, there's a component of how do we reduce the suffering of others? How do we take the skill set that we have and be of service to others? How do we make the world a better place? How do we kind of harness the energy of nature, God, the universe, and put that to use?
I love that. It makes me think like there's all these religious systems out there, and I want to point to some of the unhealthy ones that create bypassing techniques. They set like a path. Again, I was raised in adulthood in Mormonism, and it gave me ways that I could check boxes and I could do the things I was supposed to do, but the stuff going on inside of me that still wasn't healthy was never having anybody point to any place where I had to be accountable to that. So I could just pretend to be a good Mormon, check the boxes, and I was. And these systems create bypassing. And as you're in this space where you're suggesting a healthier spiritual path, people to sort of figure that out on their own, but to have some guidance in doing so, how have you avoided bypassing in your own life, Rainn? Like, how have you avoided allowing spiritual systems that you find useful, having them keep you from sort of being accountable to your own stuff going on inside and working to grow?
Well, that's a heavy question, Bill. I don't know that I have entirely. Um, so I know you guys were going to talk about it a little bit more later, but I'm a member of the Baha'i Faith, so I really love my faith greatly, um, and sometimes I struggle with it too. So there's a bunch of different components here. There's my personal relationship to my own soul and to God and to my spiritual path. And there's a relationship to my faith that is this, an organization that has an administrative structure. And, how do I integrate all of that? I don't know that I do it very successfully, but, uh, and, I'm also in recovery. So for me, my spiritual path has to do with the 12 steps and staying sober from drugs and alcohol and porn and all manner of things that are going to get me off track. And I also need spiritual tools like meditation and prayer to help me with my mental health struggles. So there's a lot of things I'm juggling with it. It's something that I need. I don't know that I do any of it successfully. I just kind of consult with a lot of people and try and slow things down and just go one day at a time.
Yeah. Have you had people convert to Baha'i from listening to you in your experience? I feel like you are like people who ask me like I'm curious about the Baha'i faith, like can you like I do think you are the most the most visible Baha'i in America. Would you say that?
I'm like the Baha'i Tom Cruise.
Kind of, yeah. Like like I do like refer people to your podcast when they're asking about Baha'i stuff. Do people
Yeah.
convert because they found Baha'i through you?
Honestly, I wish more would convert. I don't think I'm doing a very good job. No, I've heard of a handful of people. Like someone was like, "Oh, my cousin
Mm,
was at this Baha'i thing, and he said he met someone there, and they had heard about it on your podcast or
yeah.
from your book or something like that." But it's pretty few and far between. It's
Baha'i is not like an aggressive proselytizing religion in that way.
No, and it's there's not a lot. It's even hard to find stuff out there that's trying to convert you, just even online or convince you even. Baha'is strive to be egalitarian, like we love Jesus and the Bible, and we love the Islam and the Quran, and we love Buddha and Buddhism, and so and those are all legitimate. So sometimes I think people feel like, oh, Baha'i faith is so universalist. I'm kind of a Baha'i, but I also read the Bible and I meditate.
Mm,
So I'm kind of a, so there isn't, but there's a lot more to it than that. There is
mm.
a set of specific beliefs and an administration, and there's a plan there as well.
Yeah. I've wanted to ask you this. One of my concerns that I have for Baha'i is that in Mormonism, which is where we both come from, there's a history of change. Like Mormons can just decide one day that God says this now. And it does adapt, even if it is like 30 to 50 years often behind the culture. And one of the concerns I've had for Baha'i, because I really love so many of the interfaith things that they're doing, is that for its time, like Mormonism started in 1830, Baha'i 1844, and for its time, it was vastly ahead of its time as far as like equality and that interfaith work. But then it doesn't have that same history of being able to change that like a Mormonism or something would have. And so I've had this like worry as I look at Baha'i that if the world keeps progressing, but Baha'i top councils don't have power to update scripture or update mandates, is there some point in the future that Baha'i becomes obsolete? Or do you feel like the scripture and advice is timeless and that's not really a concern?
Yeah, I mean, we spoke about this before, and uh, it's a big source of debate in the Baha'i faith. Um, Namely, in the Baha'i faith, there's not very much written about homosexuality. But what is written by the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah, is that marriage is between a man and a woman. And the Universal House of Justice, which is the uh, main administrative body, they have certain abilities to kind of like interpret and adapt in some ways, but they can't overrule something that was said by the prophet founder. So this is a source of great pain and difficulty and consternation in the Baha'i faith, especially around gay marriage. Now, there's a lot of gay Baha'is, and some Baha'is do believe that ultimately this law, the way that it's not even a law, but this belief, the way that it's framed could be changed. Some believe that. I'm not quite sure what to believe. Most don't believe that. And it pains my heart. Listen, I'm a theater guy. I moved at 20 to New York and did the theater. Like, I have, nobody has worked around or loves the gays more than me. And it's being a part of a faith that doesn't um, allow for that is very painful. And at the same time, there are some subtle differences in the ways that Baha'is view morality that I think are really salient. And it's very different than a Judeo-Christian idea of morality. But in the Baha'i faith, the moral laws are said in the book of laws, they're said, think of these not as a book of laws, nay, as a choice wine. Think of these as they're there to help you take a path. They're there to help you walk to get closer to God, to help your soul develop. There's no hell in the Baha'i faith, so there isn't a sense of like damnation of like, oh, you
Mhm.
break this law, you're gonna. Um, and the only way that you kind of are cast out of the Baha'i faith is if you're actively breaking a law and promoting the Baha'i faith and saying, "Hey, I'm a Baha'i and I'm doing different than the law, and I'm breaking it and doing it different here, and drawing attention to yourself." And then you can still do that. You're just kind of lose your administrative rights. You lose your ability to vote in the Baha'i faith. So I it's a little bit of a different relationship with morality. That the idea of like Baha'is don't drink, we don't gamble, we don't supposedly use drink or drugs or adultery or whatever. That these laws, there isn't a sense of like, oh, you're burned in hell if you're going to do these things. It's they're there to kind of keep your soul kind of on track to develop in a more healthy way.
Yeah, and that's true, like, I feel like there's less people coming from Baha'i, like, so damaged because they got kicked out for being gay, like, I just don't hear stuff like that. Bill?
Yeah, I'm just it sounds interesting that it's more of maybe like a guide instead of hard and fast rules where you either make or break sort of your relationship with the religion. And I'm sitting here thinking as you're saying that, like different kinds of things draw us to spiritual paths. And it's not usually when life is going well. It's usually when things fall apart and we hit hard moments. And you mentioned earlier being in recovery. And I'm just curious if there's anything else you'd want to say about the hard moments in life that draw us to sense that we need spirituality. It's not when things are going well, it's when we bump up against the world and get hurt by it that we realize that maybe being an atheist or maybe not taking my spirituality seriously isn't good for me. Maybe I need to make a shift. And I'm just curious about some of those shifts that have happened in your life.
Well, I've had many in my life. And, even right now, I'm struggling with some mental health stuff, some real high anxiety, even some OCD symptoms that I'm working on with some therapy and medication and meditation. And, this is a lifelong struggle. It's not like, oh, I'm arrived, you know. And yeah, but when I was in my 20s, it was deep existential dread, very similar to Brit's, of like, why am I even alive? You know, what is my purpose? I was not on the verge of like, okay, I'm going to kill myself, but I was really very deeply like, why should I even be alive? And yeah, I want to be an actor, and that's good, but that was not enough for me. I always thought just being an artist and an actor was going to be enough, but it wasn't enough. And it wasn't until I really engaged with the fact that I am a spiritual being. I'm a spiritual being having a human experience, to quote Teilhard de Chardin, that when things kind of aligned for me. Oh, tests and difficulties, that makes sense from that context. And and I can rely upon God. I can grow my soul. Like the human experience is a soul growing experience, and that's when things came alive for me. And when I had addiction issues with drugs and alcohol, it was the same thing. I was trying to fill, that hole with these things from outside of myself. I even tried to fill it with fame and success and, with accolades. And I'm in a constant state of having to turn inwards.
Mm.
Love it.
We've talked about this before, and this is something that I think about all the time, like at least once a week in the work that I do, is whether or not to use the word God and how ethically I want to approach this word, because sometimes it's a unifying experience that I'm reaching towards something that other people in the past have called God, and that feels very connective. But then there's also like a disconnect there, because what you're saying about God, I feel like, not you specifically, other people, can be very toxic, or, hurt the religious part of me who had a lot of spiritual damage done in the name of that God. And so you use the word God more liberally than I do. And it's in a way that's clearly expansive and metaphorical. And I just wondered if you could kind of verbalize your reasons for why you choose to use the God word, even though it comes with baggage, because you're trying to say the word God, but have it mean something than how sometimes other people are saying the word God. And how do you approach that?
Thank you. That is a profound and perfect question for this conversation. Do I have permission to read a somewhat long quote?
Please.
Okay. I'm going back to the granddaddy hobbit of the current kind of spiritual but not religious movement, Eckhart Tolle, because I was recently just feeling really dysregulated and remembering how much his book, The Power of Now, helped me. It was about 15 years ago when I was going through a hard time. And I was struck by what he said about this very question. And he uses being instead of God throughout the book, just being with a capital B, but not even like a being, but just
Mhm.
being. And he says the word God has become empty of meaning through thousands of years of misuse. He says, I use it sometimes, but I do so sparingly. By misuse, I mean that people who have never even glimpsed the realm of the sacred, the infinite vastness behind that word, use it with great conviction, as if they knew what they were talking about. Or they argue against it as if they knew what it is that they are denying. The misuse gives rise to absurd beliefs, assertions, and egoic delusions, such as my God is the only true God. The word God has become a closed concept. The moment the word is uttered, a mental image is created, no longer perhaps of an old man with a white beard, but still a mental representation of someone or something outside of yourself and a male figure. Neither God nor being, capital B, being, nor any other word can define or explain the ineffable reality behind the word. So the only important question is whether the word is a help or a hindrance for you to experience that toward which it points. Does it point beyond itself to that transcendental reality? Or does it lend itself too easily to becoming no more than just an idea in your head that you believe in, a mental idol? I love that, a mental idol. So he goes on from there, but I just thought that was brilliant, and I do use it, and then sometimes I go, maybe I shouldn't be using it. You know, I in the book Soul Boom, I call God playfully Sky Daddy because I want to really differentiate God from Sky Daddy. And I have a chapter called The Notorious God, which
Mhm.
is kind of hopefully an explosion of God, about like, can God just be beauty? Can it be truth? Can it be science? Can it be nature? Can it be love? Why does it need to be a being, like a guy with a will that's like almost like David Bentley Hart calls it, like a demiurge, like a
Mhm.
god on a cloud, like Zeus almost. Um, and how expansive can we possibly, you know, throw our minds towards the concept? Where are you at with it these days, Brett?
Yeah, I go back and forth. We both have some follow-up questions on that one because it's a complex, game of language there. And for me, I really anytime I'm with a mystic or someone who has that just like mystic approach to spirituality, that it's about these inner states and not like the dogmas and the truth claims. Whenever mystics of any religion use the God word, like I'm totally on board because it's not that dogmatic way of like, I know that there's a man in the sky and he hates gay people and he says this and da da da, all of that. So in mystic spaces, I get a lot more comfortable using the God word because I know that it's not going to mean what I don't want it to mean. But then outside of that space, I'm much more hesitant. I rarely use it. And this is the first year for me, I have a great love of Jesus, even as an atheist. My time in theology school was very much studying the parables of Jesus, and I do have a great love and reverence for the parables of Jesus, and I deeply changed as a person by studying the parables of Jesus. But because of the environment that I find myself in, this was my first Christmas where I didn't put anything Jesus related out into in my household. And it wasn't
Mm.
because I had drastically changed my relationship to Jesus. It's because in the environment that we're in right now, these symbols of Jesus are now representing something that doesn't feel authentic to me. And so I've adjusted, not because of me personally, but because symbols of Jesus in the environment mean something very different than what I mean about Jesus. So I do sometimes shift based on like the environment and how this is going to be taken. So yeah, I'm torn on it. I love God talk in mystic Eckhart Tolle kind of spaces, but in public discourse, I usually don't use the word. And this was my first Christmas that was Jesus free because I just felt like the symbols of Jesus, particularly in America right now, really represented something that I didn't want it to represent. So Bill had some thoughts here too, though.
Yeah, I mean, it comes from Tolle. So I read The Power of Now as well. Love the quote that you just shared, but I hadn't heard that one before. So as you're reading it, I fell in love with it. This idea of how other systems define God, and really it's these hundreds or maybe thousands of years of defining him, somebody at the top of the hierarchy saying, I know the way, my experience trumps all of your experiences, and I'm going to lay out the rules of what God is or who he is. And when people ask me, Bill, are you a believer? Are you an atheist? And it's usually within the Christian perspective, I will answer the question that I'm an atheist mystic. And I'm not a like this true mystic and done any kind of training, but I want to create curiosity on the part of the person who's asking the question. I don't want them to dismiss me simply because I use the one word atheist. And so for me, it's another Tolle quote, which is, and again, I may not get this perfect, but he said, we are the universe expressing ourselves as human for a little while. And
Mm.
when I think of God, again, if we go all the way back to like in the Judeo-Christian narrative, how God is defined at the bare bones. It's the omnis, right? He's all present, all knowing, all powerful. And I can just easily, if I just go to the Big Bang, and I have no idea how that happened, but if I just accept there's a moment in time where everything came out from that. And so there's this moment, and now I fast forward, and you and me and the horses and any animals on some other planet and the planets themselves and all of space all somehow expanded forth from that. Then I can recognize that creative energy of the universe, which I think in part Tolle is expressing, that creative energy of the universe is all knowing. Everything that is known by it, because we are it. So all consciousness stemmed from it. It's all powerful because everything that's been done and created was done by it. And it's all present because it's everything everywhere. And so then I can accept like this really bare bone basic understanding of God in that way. And if I just leave a little mystery in the universe, like I'm a human being, I have such a small, limited awareness of how the universe works. Who am I to think I understand anything? So leave a little mystery that there's things out there that we still don't get, and things still happen that we can't quite explain. And there's something beautiful, and curiosity gets the best of me in those moments. Then I really can like swim in the waters of talking about God in the same way that Britt's hinting to. And so, yeah, anyway, I'm more curious about what you've got to say about that. But I align a lot with Britt in her view of like, if you can take God from being a bearded man and make it something bigger and less unhealthy and hateful, then I'm happy to jump in the car with the rest of you and take the ride.
Isn't it interesting though that we started doing lowercase g God in order to like, it's like in theology spaces, we'll be talking about capital G God and lowercase g God. Like that's a very common thing that happens in theology spaces. And then something started happening like in broader spirituality where we started to capitalize other words, like you were talking about, Rainn. And so we went from like capital G God to like lowercase g God, capital B being, or like, you know what I mean? And so there's an
Yeah.
interesting language thing that's happening where we're starting to capitalize other words so that we're saying like, this is bigger than just like being in a sense of like just walking around in the world. It's bigger than that. So we're going to capitalize it. But it's not capital G God, the one that's capitalized like in the Bible. And so yeah, I feel like society in general is kind of adjusting to this conversation because we're starting to capitalize and uncapitalize certain words in context.
I love that. That I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, it's all depends on the word that you capitalize. You can capitalize nature, capitalize universe, capitalize love,
Yeah. I've seen all those. I've seen all those,
and
yeah, capitalized.
and then it becomes a whole other context. But yeah, I think about like how much in like 1890, if you went into like Victorian London to the Science Center and you said, "Hey, how much do you think you know about the universe?" And they'd be like, "Oh, we have the scientific method. We know so much about the universe. We really have got pretty much most of it really pretty figured out." And and I would say kind of like the same thing now. I think we get very arrogant about what we know from science and from the scientific method. I mean, what percentage of just knowledge do we think we know?
Yeah, I think
Uh,
Neil deGrasse Tyson said recently that they tried to calculate this because, like, the scientists will like try to calculate things like that, the questions like that, and they came up with like of the questions that we've asked, we know 3% of what we know to ask, and 0% of what we don't even know to ask yet. And so like our ability to feel like nobody should feel confident in anything. And so when people say like, Britt, how can you even like talk confidently? It's not because I know anything. Like I really know nothing. It's why I could never finish my doctorate in theology, is because I got up to my dissertation and they're like, okay, write 200 pages about what we know, what you know. And I'm like, I don't know anything. Like theology school was like me unlearning everything. And by the time I got to the dissertation, I was like, I don't know anything. I can't write this. I don't know anything. Um, yeah. And so for me, it's like the confidence when I speak on social media is not because I think I know something. It's that I don't think you know either. So I'm going to be militant. Like I don't know shit, but like you don't know either.
yeah.
And that's where my confidence comes from, is just like I don't know anything, but I'm pretty sure you don't either. And that can give us that should give us some intellectual humility, I feel like. But that's one of the reasons why I hesitate using the God word so much, is because I do feel like humans, like that's a temptation that we have, is to start thinking like how we feel is speaking for God. And so because like we so easily move into that space of like I know what God is thinking and I know what God wants, it makes me more hesitant to use that word, just like knowing that that's our temptation, that we'll just start going down that path. But my next question for you is just we both come in contact with a lot of modern people. You live in California, I live in Idaho, so and you meet more people than I do. But you come in contact with a lot of people who just like their eyes roll in the back of their heads when you say the word spirituality, like deeply rational, deeply cynical. Have you found like a successful doorway as far as like helping them even just like listen or be receptive to the concept of spirituality? Have you found some bridges there with that particular kind of person?
Yeah, I just ignore that kind of person at this point. I feel,
Mm.
and most of those people are from my generation. It's mostly like Gen X
Mm.
people. I feel like most of those people are like 40 to 60 range. And because I feel like there was a promise of secularism that has obviously not come true. There was a promise of materialist secularism of like, hey, we're going to have rational based, materialist based, without all this, religious poppycock and mystical and spiritual poppycock. And we don't need any kind of like higher morals or transcendent or higher sense of self. And we're going to come up with rational, materialist, secular rules and have a kind of a modern coalitions and uh, have plenty of money and stuff for everyone. And this is just not working. It's not coming true. And I think that this younger generation, especially under 25, they're open to everything. They're just like, nothing's working. So, there's a lot of them going back to like Roman Catholicism, and Eastern Orthodox, because they're like, well, I don't know, my parents were atheists, or not even atheists. My parents were just secular, non-religious, but that's not really working. They trashed the environment. They were filled with greed, and uh, it wasn't just the born agains that ruined the environment over the last 30 or 40 years. It was the secular folks too, because it's like, hey, there's a lot more oil, that I always think about the country of Norway, this like rational, secular state, but they have more oil reserves than any other country in the world, and they made their fortune from oil, and are not thinking about the future of. Now they're giving all their citizens, electric cars, but not before they profited first, because at the end of the day, we'll put profit first. I'm kind of rambling right now, but I just think that the wheels are coming off, so people are kind of more open to new ideas. And one of those is that, and one of the things that I really believe is that we've got to go back to some really ancient human beliefs. And, fuck religion and fuck non-religion. The earth is sacred. The earth is beautiful and sacred, and we have to put her front and center in everything that we do. And whether you believe in God, whether you're a Christian or a Jew or a Baha'i, or no matter what you are, we have really destroyed our greatest asset, which is the beauty of planet Earth. And that honoring the sacred, I think, is a spiritual act. It is a mystical and transcendent act. But we have to do it, and it breaks my heart where we are right now.
Yeah, I want to follow up and sort of take that idea a little farther and ask you a question. There are all these religions out there, and Britt and I have had these conversations in the past where we try to figure out what is the usefulness of religion as a vehicle for technology to pass societal, tribal stories along from generation to generation, to give us a morality, to point us to the heavens, and to take in the universe, to know what time of season we should plant our crops and harvest them. I mean, we get all these things from religion. And so we debate like, hey, religion itself often shows up in these unhealthy ways, and it hurts people. And there's always people at the top of every religion who are capitalizing on power and influence and greed. And so then, there have been attempts at certain groups. One of them is Oasis, which I know, like in Salt Lake City, did pretty well for a while and then started to die out. And I'm not even sure if it's around strong anymore. I think it is still around, but I'm not sure how strong it is. And it's based this idea that these group of people show up, they still want church, but they don't want religion. So they show up and somebody gives a talk, but it's just the wisdom of the day. So they're reading Brene Brown, and they're reading something from the Buddha and reading something from Tolle. And I'm just curious if you have thoughts, because you're pointing to it, which is the value of spirituality and religion generally. Do you have thoughts about whether we get there? What do we as a human species get the ability somewhere along the way to discard specific religions and the unhealthy leadership that often comes with them, and create something that really does encapsulate the wisdom all around us, with no prioritizing or preference based on it coming from a specific tradition? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, boy, it's such a great question, and I hadn't really thought of it in those terms. Uh, I think the problem with like Christian deconstruction is you throw everything out and what do you replace it with? And because one of the things that organized religion gives you is kind of a structure and a focus. And I spoke to someone and they talked about how their wife was a Methodist and they moved to a new community, and then I think someone she got really sick or something like that, and immediately like the Methodists showed up with hot dishes,
Mm.
every night of the week and taking care of them. And they were doing service projects in the community and they were sponsoring, nonprofit work in disaster zones. And um, there was there was a kind of an organizational structure and a focus. And when you look at the forces of kind of I don't want to say evil, but the forces that are of just greed and division and hatred, they're very, very well organized. So I think this idea that you can just kind of like have spirituality be a buffet of like, oh, I like meditation and I like Eckhart Tolle and I like crystals, and I like this Rumi Instagram that I follow, and then I'm going to leave it at that. This is why I'm a Baha'i, because also I am turned on by and love the vision and the planning of the faith itself towards societal transformation, about building spiritual communities at the grassroots, about incorporating service into everything that we do, and that there's a plan, there's a structure, that we meet every few months and go over what's working and what's not and shift it and change it. And then there's you know there's there's a vision there. So I think, could there be a new, maybe you're talking about kind of a new kind of religious structure? Yeah, maybe so. Could you create a new religion of a giant, spiritual but not religion umbrella coalition that is, but could it be more rigorous than say the Unitarians? Could it be a little more rigorous than like holding hands and singing songs on a Sunday? I don't mean to diss the Unitarians, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
Uh,
this is like the conversation that I feel like atheists are having, sometimes publicly, but definitely like behind closed doors. Whenever I'm talking with atheists who work somewhere in the religious space or are interested in religion, it's 100% always this conversation, which is that we had this hope, starting with the Enlightenment, that we can just decide to live as rational, healthy, human beings. And then it never really panned out. And in that space, a lot of political religions were able to grow as we were grasping on to some kind of meaning or certainty. And then we had this new atheist movement of like, okay, but this time Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Dawkins, they're going to lead us to the promised land. We're going to really be able to do this time. We finally have enough science to like, we can do this. And then all the atheists that I talk to, really, we're talking about how new atheism kind of failed in its promise. And I think one of the biggest lies of atheism is that if you just leave religion, you'll just stumble upon like the good life or like your best, most thriving life. You'll just kind of like stumble upon it. And I've watched, um, and one of my master's projects was like watching churches who almost naively say like, we can do all the good of religion without any of the bad, and within 5 years they all fail. And so now a lot of atheists or post-religious people or deconstruction people are starting to talk about this concept of, what if the best way to actually get to where we want, where we have the baby but less bathwater, is to do more of like a secular Jew approach in like American Judaism, where like maybe we dial down some of the truth claims, but we keep the culture and the story and the ritual and the structure, and we keep some of those things. And so what if getting to something like secular Christianity is actually maybe the best thing for America. And now I'm hearing more and more atheists talk about, I don't really trust people with nothing or with just pure atheism or new atheism, but maybe we could combat, Christian nationalism with something like secular Christianity. And maybe that's the way that we kind of find that balance between nihilism and fundamentalism. Just do you have any thoughts on that? Because I feel like this is the conversation that secular people are having, this sense that we can't just create church because the stories aren't sticky enough to get us to come week after week and pour money and resources into it to be able to make a fully functioning community. And so what do we do then if we actually can't create that? Well, then do we just have to go back to religion so we have some sense of the baby, even if that means a lot of bathwater? Anyway, do you have any more thoughts on that? I think about it like all the time.
Yeah, I do too. And it's one of the central theses of Soul Boom. And I think that quite simply, what if we don't, I'm going to be a theist for a second. I think that if we don't believe in God, then I think humans are wired to worship something. And if we don't worship God, what do we worship? We either worship our careers or ourself, or we worship materialistic stuff. That's our tendency. And but in the worship of God, and if God's word is, love thy neighbor and serve the poor, and if God's word is sacrifice of yourself for the good of your neighbor, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, then you will see these religious communities, as they have done throughout the centuries, when they work, it's all about self-sacrifice. It's about communities coming together, putting aside their differences, sacrificing of their time, energy, and comfort for the poor and the downtrodden, and coming together in celebration and the creation of beauty out of a transcendent longing. And this is that religious impulse that, if you simply take God and religion out of the equation, like in the Sam Harris world, like, well, rationally, we're just going to do that. It's like communism. It's like, well, if we just put the workers in charge of the means of control, and then everyone's just going to get behind the great state of Romania and just do everything for the great state of Romania. It's like, that's just not how it's going to work. And our PhDs are going to be mopping the floors, of the basements of the hospitals. It's like, no, that's not how it's going to work. That's ridiculous. So whatever it is has to be like, we have to be in service to something larger than ourselves and sacrifice of ourselves for something greater than ourselves. That's the only way that this is going to work. That's the only way that great human movements have moved forward, and including, because we're recording this on Martin Luther King Day, including the American Civil Rights Movement, which is one of the greatest human movements of all time, is thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people sacrificing of their own comfort, their own time, and their own money, and their own energy, and their bodies, and their pain for something larger than themselves. And they did it with love as a force to propel them in that direction.
Yeah, you're hitting the nail on the head. That religion at its best is that it is this, like, for the greater good of the group, for the weakest among us, the marginalized on the sidelines. Like, can we all give more of ourselves to help the collective us thrive? But the other side of the coin is that, and it's doing the same thing, is that religion often manipulates us into sacrificing our autonomy and our individual well-being for the group thriving, for the system thriving, for the leaders thriving. And I guess, I don't know that I have a question here, but just an observation, which goes back to the statement earlier about Neil deGrasse Tyson and that research, Britt, which is, we don't quite know yet. We'd like to think we know, but maybe we know 3% of what we would like to ask or know to ask. And maybe we know 0% of what we don't know to ask about all the tools, all the technology, all the good things that religion does, which is why we created it in the first place as human beings from thousands and thousands of years ago. And that maybe we ought to go really slow at deciding what is bad and what is good until we have tons of data, way more than we currently do, about how to untangle those two sides of the coin and try to just keep the good. Any thoughts that either of you have on that?
I do, yeah. I feel like this is where like privilege often enters the conversation. And my favorite conversation that you've had, Rainn, in the past year is the one that you did. I think it was with Hassan Minaj, and it went pretty viral. And it was where he was talking about, you're a post-economic white person, like talking about spirituality as if it's something for the privileged. You're in your sauna, you can be in this. And then he said, like, when shit hits the fan, you turn to Islam. You got DUIs, you need something more structured. And to his credit, like, I thought, like, the way that he delivered it, because he's a comedian, was so funny. But the reason that it was so interesting to watch is because, like a good comedian, he was playing with a kernel of truth there.
Mm-hmm.
And to his credit, when you're talking about that we're just going to decide to rationally do this, to my credit, I think I do that pretty well. Like, but I admit that it's so hard. It is so hard that, like, I am my own engine. I have to get up and create meaning, and I intentionally create community, and I intentionally put rituals in place knowing that it's good for me, and I intentionally curate experiences of awe, and I intentionally, and like, to be your own engine like that every day in order to kind of experience the good life, and to have the education level and the time to figure out what humans need, and to figure out how I'm going to put all these things in place in my life and my family's life. It is a huge amount of energy, and, to be fair, privilege, that I'm able to do that. So for me, so then it's unfair for me to say everybody should just do what I do and do the spiritual life without God, because it is so much work, and it's really hard to, like, constantly be your own engine like that. And I have to recognize that that path is not available for everyone, because that requires a lot of privilege for me to be able to do the amount of research and have the time and intention to almost like create religion from scratch in my own life. I think it's possible. I help people do it if that's where they are, but like, I just don't think that that can be the answer for everyone. The amount of, like, the personality type you need to have to be your own engine every day, and also the privilege that you have to have, that is not available for everyone. I just don't think I can, like, stand on my high horse about it. And I thought your conversation with Hassan was like the perfect and entertaining and funny way to, like, talk about those deeper things. It was fantastic.
Right, right.
All right, and I have maybe we'll do one or two more, maybe one more question, then we'll just kind of wrap up here. We're looking at the time. If people were really enjoying this conversation, and they picked up the workbook, and if you could speak to them, what would you most hope that they would experience in their life, or changes that would happen in their life by really taking the time? Because when you're going through the workbook, it's very immersive in kind of your relationship with yourself. What would you hope for anyone who's listening who's going to pick up the workbook?
Well, I think we're doing the same work. We're just coming at it from some very different lenses. And what I would hope is that people's hearts become unlocked in a way, and that they start to see their life as more heart centered. You know, Arthur Brooks has a new book on meaning coming out in March. It's called The Meaning of Your Life, and it's really profound. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, and a lot of data, a lot of hard science. He's also a person of faith, so he has some stuff about faith in there. but he talks about how modern technologies keep us in a very left brain kind of thinking. And I'm not talking about the old way of thinking about left brain, right brain. Left brain thinking is analysis and data and like how do we do things, and it's kind of social media and spreadsheet driven, and we tend to, because we're looking at screens all day, not be accessing our right brain, which is our intuition, our heart, our soul, our big vision, our big dream of ourselves, which is also purpose and meaning on a large scale. That's beyond language. It's not like a meaning you can put into words, like, oh, the meaning of my life is love people better. It's beyond that. And I hope that this workbook can unlock people's hearts and unlock that part of themselves, that it's them spending some time away from their phones and their screens, uh, to uh, to access a part of themselves that is a mystery.
Yeah, I love that. I just did a social media post this week because there's a lot of, in atheism, there's a lot of talk about how atheists are like smarter than religious people. And so I was like, okay, guys, like let's look at the data. And we have a lot of data that shows that we evolutionarily, we have that slower, more analytical style of thinking that's good for certain things. And we have this more intuitive, which is a lot faster. Way of thinking, and that both are signs of intelligence and we need both. And I do think we're still recovering from, especially in psychology, this sense that like, and some of it I think is patriarchy too, that the intuitive is not as intelligent or something to mistrust. And I do still feel like we're recovering from that. And I think female-based forms of spirituality are really helpful for that conversation. But yeah, I do feel, and we can actually do math problems that show that, like you can do math problems to show if you're an intuitive thinker or if you're an analytical thinker. And we do have data that shows if you tend towards the analytical side, you're less likely to be religious, you're more likely to be atheist. But I want to get rid of this narrative that it's because you're smarter, because there's so much about experience and symbolism and meaning and art and even our morality as being something intuitive that we're missing if we just think that we are these analytical robots, because to be human is to be so much more than that. And this workbook is fantastic for digging into that side of your brain/soul, depending on your beliefs there. So everybody check out the Soul Boom workbook. And Rainn, thanks so much for being here today. We'll let you go and I'll stay on with Bill and chat a little bit longer. But thank you so much for spending your
Hey,
MLK day with us today.
I love it. Thanks for having me. I can't believe I was the first guest. I'm so honored to be here and to be a part of this.
Thank you.
Uh,
Yeah, thank you
Thanks
so
so
much.
much. You're having really beautiful, important conversations. Bill, so nice to meet you. Thanks for having me.
You as well, my friend.
Keep
Thank
up
you.
the good
All right.
work. We're excited for what the podcast brings for the next year.
Thanks, guys. Talk to you soon, I hope.
All right. Thanks, Rainn. Bye.
Take care. Bye.
All right, Bill, thoughts?
First off, what a cool first interview. You just got to talk to Rainn Wilson,
I know.
who played Dwight Schrute on The Office, huge fan of The Office.
I forgot to tell him too. Oh, I was gonna tell him this, that my that I gotta say it so that it's at least recorded somewhere. My littlest boy is autistic, and he has like certain routines that help him to calm down. And one of his routines is specifically Moroccan Christmas from The Office, where Dwight sprays the fire extinguisher on Meredith, who is caught on fire. And he just plays it over and over. It's one of his like TISM calm down loops. And I wanted to thank him for that because it's so meaningful in my life and I forgot to. Dang it.
Well, I think the kind of humor that The Office portrayed, I think a lot of people gravitated to it for various reasons, and it sort of displays some of the stuff that we sense in life, but exaggerated. And I'll just say to see Rainn again. I listened to the interview that he had with you, following up here in this conversation and being prepared for this. To see somebody who made their living in the space of comedy, and who then shows this very serious side of himself and is really trying to wrestle with the human story and trying to figure out the bigger questions. It's such a cool thing to juxtapose the character he plays with this serious person who's delving into these things in this space.
Yeah, and it's so interesting now to go back to The Office because I know enough about his story to know the years that he was really struggling. And so like he'll be playing Dwight and I'm watching him play Dwight, but then this other side of me is like, "Oh, this is actually the chapter of Rainn Wilson the person's life where he's struggling with alcohol, where he is like coming to work and doing the best he can here." And you would think that like he's having so much fun, like him and Michael and Jim, and like this must be just like the best life. But in actuality, like he was really struggling in the time period when he's shooting this. And later he's going to, really go back to his Baha'i faith and he's going to be doing better. And so sometimes I'm actually like watching Rainn Wilson in the show too, because I can know kind of like where he is in his timeline. And I do really wonder still to this day, I asked him this question when I went on Soul Boom, is I really do wonder if he would have had more resources for this. I call myself a spiritual atheist. You call yourself an atheist mystic. They're basically the same. We've influenced each other even in getting there, as we've had conversations for the past 15 years. I do wonder if he would have had more resources for that approach, if that would have been enough for him, because he kind of went back to God more than you and I did.
Yeah. And everybody's different. To tie these two things together, I mean, you mentioned your kid, you mentioned him and what he was dealing with. There was somewhere in our conversation today where he talked about anxiety.
Yeah.
And there's a part of me that just thinks all of us humans are dealing with anxiety. If we go back 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, it benefited us to be anxious. We've talked about this before, that you see the marks on the trees in the distance and it looks like it's the eyes of a predator. You are better off to make the guess that it is a predator than to assume it's not, because one side will feel anxiety and survive. One side will go into fight or flight and survive, and the other side will be lulled into being eaten. And so it has benefited our human bodies to be anxious about the day-to-day grind of life. And part of my work in being a somatic informed trauma coach is helping to teach people, like, the difference in today's world is realizing that, like, if I look around, like, oh, this is actually safe here. I'm feeling anxiety about this thing in my world. But and one of my clients just said the other day, her new mantra is, the saber-toothed tiger is not here. Because if you can teach yourself, like, oh, like, it's safe here, and I'm in a safe world, but I'm feeling anxiety as if there's a predator because of this thing going on in my life. And so I think we're all dealing with stuff and we're all trying to cope with things. And we look at somebody playing a comedic actor on television and we think, like, oh, like you said, they've got it figured out, having the time of their life. And they're just a human being having a human experience with all the past traumas they've had, all the pressures of life that are on them to perform well. And they're just trying to get by day to day as well.
Yeah, what do you think about this question? You and I could spend a lot of time here because there's a lot of places to go. But when he was talking about being an addict, having mental health struggles, and that part of his spiritual path is also AA and the 12-step program. Like, I know people who talk about how AA is a cult, like it's a secular religion and can function like a cult in ways that are harmful. But for him, it's like something that really keeps him from that edge there. And so we do know that if you struggle with mental health, if you have addictions, like my brother, who I hope never leaves Mormonism because statistically it would be such a damage to his sobriety, it makes me a little bit more humble about sometimes my atheist attitudes that I get, because it goes back to this really complex conversation, which is, do we value truth, or do we value well-being? Like, I don't believe in the God that my brother believes in. I think some of his support, even in being a Mormon, is harmful. And yet I kind of like, because I care about the well-being of my brother, or the well-being of Rainn Wilson, who's an addict, do I really push back on, well, AA is a cult, and Baha'i, they don't let women in their top councils. They don't allow for gay marriage. I find that problematic. Do we go after that on the basis of truth if it lowers well-being? What do you think about that? I think about that a lot.
Yeah. On the front end, I want to be a truth seeker, right? I want to
I know.
discard the bullshit, even if it hurts me, even if it severs relationships, even if it means loss of community, even if it means a unraveling of my identity and something needs to be built back up. And on the backside, I would go, well, that's Bill, you're just doing more additional bullshit to yourself. The real goal, even if you value truth, I help this community, this post-Mormon community, deconstruct their religion and then not end up in despair, to find human flourishing again. So I'm self-acknowledging really what I care about is human flourishing. I don't want someone to be manipulated and spend their life wasted in a lie because they were given a lens and the leaders of that lens lied to them and betrayed them. I want them to get out, but I want them to get out and flourish like they never have before.
Yeah.
So I'm self-admitting that human flourishing is the goal. So I got to on this front end, because we have had this conversation before.
Yeah.
On the front end, I have to just acknowledge that up front. The goal is human flourishing. And if someone is at has a perspective or is at a stage of development or has had certain life experiences that they are in a certain place, we ought to preference whatever it is that they need to flourish to the best of their ability as a human being.
Yeah, and Alex O'Connor asked this question to Sam Harris, that if you could know that we can't survive well without these things that, aren't true but help people cope, what do you do about that? And he said, if I could know that we wouldn't flourish, post death of God, that he would pull all his books off the shelf, that he hopes that we can have some truth and learn how to flourish, right? But if we found out that we couldn't, that he would take all his books off the shelf and just say, hey, being a human is hard, cope as best you can. And this is where you get into this really tricky place, because I feel like right after we leave Mormonism, at least for me, I was like, truth matters. This is true. Why doesn't everybody care about what's true? Why isn't everybody willing to sacrifice to learn what's true? It was really a driving motivator. And then you get to a space where you've deconstructed so much that you realize that I don't even know if we're accessing truth or if we're accessing ultimate reality or what is true. So then why am I on this high horse about Mormonism's not true, but then there is no ultimate truth. So then what was the point of all of that? But I ended up in a very similar place, which is then you start playing this kind of out of the matrix game, which is, what is the most truth that you can handle in the chapter of life that you're in? And we do this as parents, right? I don't lie to my children. We have a very strong rule of honesty, and I have a very my children really trust me. I don't lie to them, but I do give them the most truth that they can handle for where they are. And that is different for different stages of life. And now truth becomes this kind of matrixy thing, where what's the most true for this situation rather than some ultimate truth. And that's where it gets really gray and deconstructed and sometimes complex. Whereas when I was first leaving Mormonism, it was just oh, Mormonism's not true. And it was it seemed a lot simpler.
I was on a walk the other day with a friend. They're also in this coaching, doing this coaching work. And they had a client, and it's chronic fatigue syndrome. Their body is not, because of trauma, because of things that have happened in the past, situations they've been in, their body, the body keeps the score. Their body has taken on these things so that they're not able to quite perform the way life and the world requires you to. So they're seeking out help to sort of separate the trauma from the body's responses to the trauma. And they were relaying to my friend who's coaching them, they were relaying to my friend the perspective that they had. It was this, it's not religion, but it was one of these woo guru folks who was selling them a certain concept of why your body's doing this. And my friend, who's the coach, had that same perspective a decade ago when she was in the middle of chronic fatigue syndrome. And so she took on sort of a spiritual belief about what that meant that wasn't accurate, at least as she figured out for herself was accurate. So she has a client now who's in this old paradigm, but is finding usefulness from it. And we had this
That's
debate.
complex. Yeah, it's complex.
Right. Do you wake them up from that? Do you take them out of that to give them more truth? And we both arrive at the decision like, no, this is the season of their life where they need to be allowed to hang on to this perspective. And someday it really is up to them to wake up from that, figure it out, and step into something closer to what reality is. But it's not my job or your job or her job to shake people from that. And as you and I both know, to do that prematurely to someone is almost always the opposite of beneficial. There's always these negative outcomes of forcing people who need certain constructs and perspectives and trying to shake them to your point of view, which you think is more advanced.
Yeah.
You're just going to do damage to people.
Yeah, and if you really are honest about yourself, you're doing it so that you can be validated, because we just want to be validated. I just wanted someone to tell me that, like, hey, like, you really thought through your deconstruction and I trust you on your journey. That's all I wanted someone to say to me, because everybody told me I was going to hell. And so, like, are we then just trying to get people to, the truth, what we consider the truth, so that we can be validated? And if that's the driving thing, then that's not maybe the most moral thing. But this is where we get to a place where I feel like we both are. You may say this different than me, where I used to believe that maybe secular utopia was possible. But then realizing the more that I understand about human nature, that you and I are both willing to pay harsh costs for truth, but that's like a core value that we have, and not everybody has that core value. And how could you possibly create some kind of secular utopia where everyone is like, the world is like Denmark, if not everybody has that kind of core value? And then realizing that maybe that utopia isn't possible, then me acting in the world as if it's possible is delusional. That's like a religious delusion almost. And so now I'm in this more complex place that I want religion to get healthier for the people who are in it. I see a lot of beauty in it. I see the good that it does. I want it to get better and healthier. I want secularism to get better and healthier, so it has a lot more tools and resources for people who want to come at it outside of religion because of religious trauma, or because religion doesn't work for them, or because this truth thing is like too, sticky here. And now I just kind of am invested in all of that getting better, rather than just like, oh, it has to be this kind of like secular utopia that I don't think is possible. I think that's almost delusional now.
So this, where rubber meets the road for me, this has been playing out
a
couple of weeks. So I haven't been to church, other than there was a time where I was deconstructing new Mormonism wasn't true, still trying to figure something out there. And I went back to church with friends who were also deconstructing because their kid was going on a mission or some ritual was happening. And I wanted to support the family or friends of people I love. And I haven't been to church though, for like me wanting to go to church to take in a religious service for more than since 2019, 2018, somewhere in there. So 7 years, 8 years. And just 2 weeks ago, I'm sitting at home and I'm like, I'm not finding community. I'm not finding the meaning I want. And I'm like, let me try to find the most inclusive Christian religion. Because like you said, if you will let me believe in Jesus mythically, non-literally, I can talk about the things he taught, the things he mostly said. I can talk about those all day long and find beautiful conversations that we could have. So I'm like, okay, what's the most inclusive, non-literal church here in Cedar City, Utah, which is a small town, a little bigger than some, but smaller than most. And it tells me it's the Presbyterian church on the other side of town. And
I'm on the edge of my seat, by the way.
I love it. So I get a couple of other answers too. There was some other church. One was called Sunrise here in Cedar City, but spelled S-O-N. So S-O-N. I emailed them. I emailed the other ones. Presbyterian, I set off to the side because ChatGPT tells me it's the most inclusive. So it's already on the top of my list. You don't really need an answer. I want to go see it. I email the Sunrise Church, and one of their representatives calls me, and he says, what are you looking for? I'm like, well, I'm looking for an inclusive church where I can show up with my non-literal belief, and you're not going to force me to wear a mask, to be silent, to sit in a corner. And he's like, well, tell me what you believe. And I start sharing my beliefs, and he proceeds for 45 minutes to tell me how wrong I am, and how his fix is that I need to have more faith and read the books and pray the answer.
No.
I'm in my head going, dude, like you don't even see what's going on here, but you were offered an opportunity, and you just showed up in a way that confirmed you are the thing I'm not looking for.
Oh.
All right, put that off to the side.
Okay.
Sunday shows up. I get up in the morning. Presbyterian church starts at 10. I walk in. The decor of the church building, the pews look like Mormon pews. It's got the Mormon, up front, but there's a big cross on the wall. But this big sign across the side of the building was inside the chapel. All are welcome, and something like, and we mean all. And I thought, all right, good start. The opening hymn was a song called Come As You Are. And the song was so inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
The sermon was so inclusive. Everything was so beautiful. It became crystal clear, both in the service as well as the potluck after, that I could come to this with entirely non-literal belief. I could join this church. I could get baptized. I could show up every week, and I would fit in as much as anyone else fits in. And I thought that was so great. I cried half the service. I was touched. Like I was in a space that was, my thought in my head was, what if this had been the system that 17-year-old me had been drawn to? What a different story that would have been. I wouldn't change it because I like all that came out of that narrative, but I wouldn't have been traumatized by my religion. I would have had a peaceful coexistence with God, and wouldn't have wrestled in the same ways with things, and wouldn't have been harmed in the same ways. So I thought it was beautiful. I got ready this past Sunday. A week. Now we're fast forward a week. And I'm sorry I'm rambling, but I want to tell a story.
I love it. I'm on the edge of my seat. I'm so curious.
So Sunday comes. I get up in the morning. I'm like, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to go. I'm going to see if it does this again for me. And I sat in the pew, and it was just as inclusive. The sermon was just as beautiful. The service was just as nice. And I got like 5 minutes from the end, and I thought, no, I think my work here is done. I went back to my home and went on a hike, and got way more from the hike than I did from the church service. So by the way, folks, the Presbyterian church on the northeast corner of Cedar City, Utah, is where you want to go if you're within 50 miles of here. And I don't know if I'll go back. Maybe I will from time to time, but it isn't my weekly religion community.
Yeah.
Wrestling with God.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it reminds me of Cara Burrell. She is doing a 30-day, I'm going to go back to being Mormon. And as part of her project, she's training to be a spiritual director through the program that I did. And when she went to church, she found herself crying through the session because it was someone giving just a really beautiful sermon about Jesus and about, how he's not politically left or right and what he would have done. And it was a beautiful, like Jesus-centered, like historical Jesus, parable Jesus-centered sermon. And she was just weeping, being back in this ward building, hearing something beautiful about what you would hope someone would say in this environment about Jesus. But when I went to church, the last time I went to church was over Christmas. And it was just because my mother-in-law had invited us, and it's important to her. And it's one of those things that, like, hey, showing up for people that I care about is authentic too, and so I wanted to show up, and I'm also curious to see how it goes. And I did not have a crying great experience. I had an experience where tell me if you got into Mormon like lore enough to remember this, but do you remember the doctrine that's about like how Noah is Angel Gabriel? Do you remember that one?
Yeah.
So my talk, like the Christmas sermon, was about how imagine what this would be like as Angel Gabriel because he's Noah. And it's so wild. It's like such a wild, even for Mormonism, it's pretty wild. Like that's a pretty big tangent. Not even, there's a lot of Mormons who have never even heard of that, who are practicing Mormons. So that for me was like, all right, that's enough of that. I can't do this
How
anymore.
did that show up? Like, what were some of the connections that either the speaker or you're making about what that looks like? What are like, like what are the sharp edges?
Oh, it's tough because I feel like I mentally checked out and I also have my kids there. But it was like remembering Noah's day and his warning to everyone and how everyone's attitude was, and then coming and being the angel, and how Gabriel would see similarities between his time period and that time period, and how, what he would see today. And it's full on like Lord of the Rings lore at this
Yeah.
point. Like that's what it sounds like, but it's like the Christmas sermon. It was so crazy. So I will not be going back.
Yeah. And for people listening who have never been Mormon, I imagine a lot of the folks who follow you
Yeah.
never even been in a Mormon chapel to enjoy a Mormon service. We also have this other additional doctrine, which comes into my head as you're sharing that, which is that Mary is impregnated by God himself through some
Right.
foreshadowing power of where he's actually having intercourse with her, and Noah being Gabriel and having all this interaction. Like you have this sexual assault victim who's raped by God and then has interactions with heavenly messengers who say like, no, it's okay. Like it's all right. And there's so much stuff when you understand Mormonism and all of the absurd narratives we tell about what stories existed in its early history. When
Yeah.
you see all that from the collective 20,000 foot view,
I
yeah,
feel like we've,
yeah.
except for this rogue talk that I don't even know how that happened. I do feel like we started to become more self-aware that our Christmas story is going to be different, and we kind of just said, let's go mainstream on this one. Let's not tell people how much weirder our Christmas story is compared to Christianity. But yeah, it was pretty wild. But then like this is a conversation I feel like is really happening with people. John Dehlin just got in hot water with a lot of ex-Mormons by saying that there are times that like he wishes he could go back to church, that if he could be a secular Mormon the way that some people are secular Jewish, that they participate in the rituals but don't believe in God, still have a bar mitzvah, still go to the synagogue, that he would do that. And a lot of ex-Mormons felt really betrayed by that. And he had to go make a follow-up statement that like, yes, I understand the harm. I wouldn't support the harm. I would stand up against it. But there is this kind of collective thing happening where secular post-religious, post-deconstruction people are noticing that like, hey, our secular stories aren't enough. Like, I don't think a secular version of Mormonism is possible given what human nature is. It doesn't tap into our culty nature enough with these like secular kinds of religions to get us to go every week to build community. And it's sad because it means that my children are the ones that really, I feel like, get the short end of that stick, because even at UU, which does religion or an approach to religion as well as you can, there are no children in at least in the congregation of Boise. And when I talk to UU pastors, they're not retaining the children. These are mostly just like liberal, washed out Christian hippies. Is kind of like, it tends to be an older population. And so then what do we do if we can't create what was beautiful about community, um, without stickier stories and myths? And that, I feel like that's really where the conversation is shifting to, versus 10, 20 years ago when new atheism was kind of really a big thing. There was a lot more hope that science would be able to solve these problems.
Yeah, when I left Mormonism, I gave the Community of Christ a try. Again, for people who have never had interaction with Mormonism, Community of Christ used to be called the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints. It's a much softer, more accountable, more inclusive, at least in the modern moment, version of Mormonism. And so going back to your conversation earlier with Rainn, where we talked about like, could we figure out how to get to something more secular that still had the tools? And trying the Community of Christ, I walked in and I go like, yeah, like it's inclusive and women are involved and homosexuality is dealt with in a way that's more healthy and maybe healthy generally. And it doesn't have the truth claims, and it allows lots of room for non-literal belief. And you can even throw out not even using the Book of Mormon in its entirety. And you could just essentially discard the Mormon foundational story and still be a part here. And I thought, no, this isn't my Mormonism. I don't really like this. And I wanted my Mormonism, but not the unhealthiness. And then I thought, well, I don't know that you can have one without the other.
I don't think that you can. I don't think that you can. So I'm in this place now that I appreciate the people in religion who are, the Richard Rohr types that, clearly will speak out against the harm and support that more mystic branch in whatever their religion is. I don't feel like that branch exists anymore in Mormonism. I've kind of mourned that. And so now I'm in a place where I feel like there are times, maybe not for everyone, but there are times where I do think it's harder to have quote unquote all the elements of the good life, and do it just with my own intentionality. I do think sometimes that's harder than just like being Mormon or being whatever and just showing up and getting a lot of those elements. And I want to try because that feels ethically the best for me, and I want to help other people who are in a space that they're never going to go back to religion or God but are struggling with nihilism or existential crisis. But I do have to admit sometimes that it's harder, and so therefore it's not for everyone, and sometimes privilege has to play a role here. And my husband's going through this right now. I was the one who left first in our relationship. He eventually also left and is now an atheist. And he's in a space where he's realizing that he just said this last week that there were a lot of things in his life that was easier when he was Mormon, even though Mormonism takes so much of your time and is a high demand religion. And he's kind of really, he's in a chapter where he's kind of struggling in that space. And that's where the atheist conversations take a turn, instead of it being like, we're right and you're stupid, which is how a lot of it is, especially online, because it's so easy. And I do it too, to like make fun of things that religion does. But then after a while, like if you really start talking about the good life, you get to a space where you realize, oh, it's actually harder to build all this into your life by yourself.
Yeah, you spoke at length, again, the privilege part, but also just the time and energy and effort and intention it takes to deconstruct things, get curious about all things, not settle on any one answer as the solution again, and build a life where you feel like you're thriving and flourishing.
And then build a family too, like build a family culture from scratch. That has taken me so much work.
Yeah. And so to have that, most people don't have the time.
Yeah. Like I have a degree in it. I can't expect everybody to do that.
No. So we ought to make space for people whose lives are so difficult, complex. They don't have the privilege. They don't have the time or energy. They're barely keeping things going. That the best thing for them might be the system that supports them and loves them in the best way that it can, and shows up with casseroles and helps with the babysitting and gives them a place where they feel like they belong and are needed. Yeah.
Let me ask you this last question and then we'll probably wrap up, but super happy with our first interview kickoff conversation here. I did a video this week about, there was kind of a viral thread, I don't know how to say that, about how much woo is harmful. And so the thread was something like, what's something that you do that is really woo and weird, but you do it anyway? And people would it was just thousands of comments of like little superstitious things that people do. Like people would kind of personify their home, or things that were just like mostly harmful. Like when I pull into a parking lot, I pray to Saint Anthony because he's the saint of finding things. And it always helps me find a parking lot, but I don't even really believe in that. And it was just thousands of ways that people find little ways to cope, little tricks that are kind of woo. They kind of know that it's a little out there, but they do it anyway. And it was really interesting. And the entire list is what I would call non-harmful. Like nobody's kicking their gay kid out of, out of the house. It's just these little mind games that people play that are superstitious. And so the question came up, which is how much woo is actually unhealthy, because there are some people, more the Sam Harris types, I've heard him answer this question, where he believes like all magical thinking is harmful. It's all harmful, even if you can't see the direct harm. And the example that he used was when they started to do stem cell research, all these people who believe in souls, who were doing like, it's totally harmless to believe in a soul. What damage am I doing to the world? But then when it was time to do stem cell research, all these soul people started to show up and say like, hey, I don't think that we should be doing this, and shut down research that could, like, real world problems could be solved, spina bifida, whatever it is. But now these soul people are in the way. And so there are some atheists who say that all magical thinking is going to somehow show up in the world where we're going to be doing superstitious things rather than practically like dealing with the issue in reality. And that's going to be a harm. And then there's a lot of people, I call it the Stephen Fry atheist, because Stephen Fry is very into ritual and he is very into story and symbolism. And he says that we need more of this kind of magical thinking, but knowing that it's not real because it's human and it helps us. And there's all these reasons. So do you feel like you're more of like that Sam Harris side atheism or like the Stephen Fry when it comes to magical thinking? What do you think?
Probably a mix of both.
You can't do that. That's the cop out. You can't say both.
All right. So,
as far as like how dangerous do you feel like magical thinking is? If it doesn't cause direct harm, do you let it go? Or do you still push back on magical thinking even if it doesn't have direct harm?
I think some forms of magical thinking create more curiosity. Example would be going back to our original conversation we had a couple of weeks ago. We talked about living in a simulation and aliens and that kind of stuff. And like, I don't believe those things, but I'm open enough to believing in those things that I'm curious and I want to constantly test the integrity of the structures of reality as I think it is versus the structures of what that reality would be, and keep open to like what is. And I think curiosity and openness keep pushing us to test our own ideas and hence force us on some level to at least think about being more inclusive and more open to other people's experiences, their values being different than ours. And then another example, I can't show you because it's on the other wall around the corner, but I have a artistic depiction of my mom. It's based on a photograph where she's holding her first great grandson just weeks before she dies of stage 4 cancer. And I walk that image of my mom. If I showed it to you, you'd see it. You could pick out any facial expression in that one picture. She could be happy for me, disappointed in me, sad about what happened to her, wanting me to be happy for her because she's moved on to someplace that's peaceful. And every time I walk by the image, the painting of her, I talk to her and I say things. Yeah, I know, Mom, I had a rough day today too. Whatever it is, I say something. And there's a part of me that thinks I'm talking to my mom. And there's the majority of me that knows it's just a depiction of my mother and it's not real at all. And I think if magical thinking helps you to flourish and it doesn't lead you to being judgmental or backing up through confirmation bias your own beliefs and hence hurting people in the name of God or whatever that magical thinking is, then I'm okay with it. So I'm going to say I'm more in favor of the latter than the former.
I would say 10 years ago, I would have been the former. And I think it's because I was so hurt by magical thinking and I had such pains in every time I built some kind of theological construct and wrapped my identity around it, and then it would fail. And then it was just like such like a devastating identity death again, that I just was burned by magical thinking, that I had some trauma around it. And what happened was then like the just purely rational, purely atheistic, materialistic, it felt safe for me. And I just needed a chapter where I could just be safe there because I had some triggers. But me in my healing era had, especially in the past 5 years, have really opened up because I've been able to process some of that trauma response. But that's like where I started to see my own hypocrisy, that if other people go to religion and they're doing it for comfort, but I'm going to pure intellectualism also because of comfort, because it feels the safest. Are we both just having a human response? And am I no better than anyone else because I go to rationalism to feel safe? You go to church to feel safe. We're both just having a human response. And that realization like took out a lot of my high horse hypocrisy. And I started to be a lot more open uh to play. And I still have rationality at the door. I never like will turn that off. I'll never do that again. But I can now go into spaces like, for me it's there's like a coven and a pagan witchy kind of space that I tap into sometimes. And it's very symbolic. And some people believe and some people don't. And they know that it's not real, but they're playing in it anyway. And it's incredibly powerful to be with this group of women doing symbolic things together. And I wouldn't have been able to do that 10 years ago, but I can now, and it gives my life a lot of value. So I'm leaning more and more into that space. But if I get a little triggered, or if someone's talking about religion in a way that triggers my wounds, then I do get really rough on magical thinking. So I've changed. I've changed because of some triggers.
I'll say one little thing about that, and then you can do what you want with it. But Santa Claus in our culture isn't, there is these magical thinking stories that permeate all societies, permeate all religions. I remember learning of some Native American or South American religious ritual practice where all through the young person's childhood, the adults once a year would dress up in scary costume and scare the children like in the nighttime when they're sleeping. And then when that kid enters a certain age, sort of the transfer from childhood to adulthood, but it was young, I think it was like 12 or 13, they would play out the same thing. The person dressed in the costume would go into the tent or whatever and would take the kid, drag them out again, same as they did in other years past, but would then take off the mask, show them that they're one of the elders of the tribe, and then pass on the ability to now be one of them when that happens each year.
Mm-hmm.
First off, I have a lot of things to say about the unhealthiest
Yeah.
of this kind of ritual.
Yeah.
This ritual that exists somewhere in the world. I don't remember who it was. And I'll just note that every culture has that. And in my mind, I like to think the magical thinking story is the bathwater, and there's something else that's the baby that is utilized by these stories.
Mm-hmm.
But on this side of things, I want to at least say maybe magical thinking itself is in part the baby. And that our ability as humans to think that way is as old as language. It's as old as looking up at the sky and not having an explanation for what the shiny things out there are, or the stars shooting across the sky. And that maybe magical thinking is, at least in part, a place where our safety and certainty about things that we shouldn't feel safe and certain about at all and should live our every day scared as hell. Maybe magical thinking is part of the human benefit to us to have it. Anyway.
Yeah, we've talked before about Santa, because when I was Mormon, I didn't do Santa because I was so Jesus. I was like one of those, like, we're going to focus on Jesus for Christmas people. And then when I deconstructed, like, Jesus was problematic, and I still couldn't do Santa because it felt like I was lying or setting my kids up to believe in God. And you were in a place where you could do Santa in what you felt like was a positive way in my family. And we've had this conversation years ago where I was like, I can't do it. And now I'm in a place where my kids are older, so I couldn't go back and do Santa because I didn't, so they all don't believe in Santa. But I'm in a place where if it was part of my family culture in whatever way, I could, whereas in years past, like, I really couldn't. And for me, it was like realizing like in my trauma response, that I have Lord of the Rings Day with my kids. We celebrate May the 4th, which is Star Wars Day. We dress up, we have food, we watch the movie, we play with lightsabers. Is it capital R real? No, but it's a great way for me to like The Mandalorian was the first show that my whole family liked, and so it was like, okay, we need some kind of family culture here. You guys all like this, so we're going to do some of this. And it became a way that we talk about good and evil and empires and fighting back against injustice. It became part of our family culture. And then the realization of like, oh, I can do with this with Star Wars, but I can't with Santa. That's probably a me issue. Like that's like a trauma thing, because Santa and Jesus have its baggage, but Star Wars doesn't. So I can play in the Star Wars space, but I can't with the Santa place. And that again is like me realizing some of my own hypocrisies or my own trauma. And so I'm in a place now, because we've had this conversation, where I could do Santa more, but I couldn't years ago. And to your point there with the rites of passage, I am fascinated by this. Like we're learning that there was more science behind religion than we thought there was, like with rites of passage that every culture does, that an adolescent brain is changing so much that if you can give it a time where it says you were a kid, now you're this other thing now, it helps the brain. And so when we threw away rites of passage in the past 100 years because they're superstitious or quote unquote not real, we actually did scientifically lose a tool that helped adolescents say, I'm a different thing now, which was good for their brain. So we're uncovering that there was more science behind these things than we thought at first.
All right.
Anyway,
I said I wouldn't say anything else, but I have to jump in.
It's so good. Yeah.
Part of what I think magical thinking for children does is it distances the evil of the world to something that's more abstract and ambiguous. So again, I've said this before, Boogeyman Underneath the Bed is a much safer story to teach your kid than the neighbor 6 houses down is a sexual predator and you should stay away from him, not talk to him. And so we've given our children ways to understand good and evil that feels safe for a child. And I know that we would think it is healthy and responsible. No, you need to tell your kid the realities of life. And the science behind that says that is not always good. And it's often really bad for them, that they need these child kind of stories about good and evil.
These playgrounds to explore these concepts.
So when the latest Marvel movie comes out, whenever that happens, whether it's Spider-Man or Thor or whatever happens, we pay our 20 something bucks. We go into a theater, we get some popcorn, we sit down, the lights go down, and the movie's intention is to draw us in so that we know it's not real. But for 2 hours, our brain is sort of living in a paradox where it's kind of real. And the realness of the magical thinking story is what draws us in to see the characters as real people who are working out real life problems. But the magic around it also distances it from reality. And so if some really cool thing happens where you're wrestling with the kinds of choices that human beings have to make about good and evil, right and wrong, responsible and irresponsible, healthy and unhealthy, but from a place that's distanced from your reality. And there's something really cool about the ability to think about problems in that space. That maybe it's no different than Moses parting the Red Sea or the Dead Sea, whichever one it was, or the flood being a global flood and Jonah's being swallowed by a whale, or a donkey talking, or Samson not having his hair cut. Maybe even as we believe that, maybe there's a part of our brain that doesn't believe it. And those are the best spaces to wrestle with the questions of what it means to be a good human being.
Yeah. Would you go to a Sunday scripture study that took the story as something symbolic of human nature to explore, and everybody just talks about it and it's not real? Right? Yeah.
Every week for that church.
I know. I've actually seen people do it. This was back when the podcast, it was like Harry Potter and the Sacred something, where people were doing that, were treating Harry Potter as scripture, not as capital R real. they're not doing it really anymore because of, statements around trans issues and things like that. But they were treating it as like, there's themes, there's some classic themes here. Let's read this chapter and talk about it as if it's church. And people really enjoyed it while it was going. And that's such an interesting way to explore scripture. All right, we will save, like, there's so many tangents we can go to, but we'll save all the rabbit holes for other episodes coming up. So please subscribe if you haven't. Subscribe to Almost Awakened, where Bill is putting his own content there with his work as a trauma-informed coach. And subscribe here to No Nonsense Spirituality, where I put also my own content. And then when we team up together, we'll put it on both channels here. And then we have some awesome conversations coming up for the next month. We have Liz Bukhar, who is a professor of religion, who talks about how to steal from religion ethically. Super important conversation. We're going to be having on he's really big on Instagram, reason and religion. He's an atheist philosopher who studies religion. We're also we're going to talk about him about, is truth worth knowing, which is one of our favorite conversations, but we'll have a new voice to talk to about that. We'll have Jeremy, who's on TikTok as the skeptic pastor. So he is actually a skeptic, but has a job as a pastor. We'll be talking to him. And that's just for January. So we have a lot more coming up in February too that I'm in talks with, and just really excited to join up with my friend Bill for these conversations, because I loved our conversation with Rainn, but I love our post commentary conversations too. And we will be I'm forcing Bill, like, I'm putting our friendship on the line, that like, you have to do this. Like, I'm forcing you to do this, that he's going to watch Pluribus, because of all the people that I want to talk about this Pluribus show with, it's Bill Reel here. And we'll be talking about that one too. So lots of fun conversations coming up. Any last words, Bill?
I'll just say, for folks that have watched this, please leave your comments down below. Would love to know what you thought of the conversation with Rainn Wilson. Would love to know what you thought of the conversation Britt and I had afterward. What parts you liked, what things you didn't, what places you would have liked to have gone in the conversation. All of that interaction is much appreciated by us. So please leave your comments.
Yeah, please leave excellent. Please subscribe and leave your comments so that we can know, as we're navigating these conversations, what you guys like to hear about. And I'm so excited to talk about Pluribus with you, Bill. Like, I need you to get on that train. It's going to be so interesting to have this conversation.
I'm excited.
It's so good.
I can't wait.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks everybody. And we will see you next time with Bill Reel and Britt Hartley.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Britt Hartley of No Nonsense Spirituality.
And Bill Reel from the Almost Awakened podcast.
Together, we explore what it means to grow beyond belief systems and find meaning after deconstruction and outside of religion.
Britt has a master's degree in theology with a focus on the future of American religion, and works as an atheist spiritual director, helping people navigate life beyond faith.
And Bill is a somatic trauma-informed coach and certified leader holding a level 7 diploma in strategic management and leadership. He helps people through faith transitions, deconstruction, and personal growth.
You can find Britt's courses, coaching, and her best-selling book, No Nonsense Spirituality, all the tools, no belief required, at nononsensespirituality.com.
And you can find Bill's coaching, support groups, and podcasts at awakenandthrive.org, resources designed to help you awaken and thrive in the second half of life.
Thanks for listening. Stay curious, stay open, and keep awakening. No nonsense required.